Hello and welcome back to a dramatic reading of His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik, Book 1 of the Temeraire series. And we are actually in the section of the book, Book 2, which is Chapter 4, and this is the second sitting that I've done here to get through the chapter. Forgive me, it's been a little bit busy these last couple of days at work and with the family and such, but I do want to keep plowing through the story because we're getting in the meat of it, and I don't want to leave you hanging, or myself, now that all the memory of the first chapters are top of mind. So let's keep going. The flight to Nottinghamshire took several hours and afforded him more leisure than he liked to consider what awaited him in Scotland. He did not like to imagine what Bowden and Powys and Portland all expected him to disapprove so heartily, and he still less liked to try to imagine what he should do if he found the situation unbearable. He had only once had a truly unhappy experience in his naval service. As a freshly made lieutenant of 17, he'd been assigned to the Shorewise under Captain Barstow, an older man and a relic of an older navy, where officers had not been required to be gentlemen as well. Barstow was the illegitimate son of a merchant of only moderate wealth and a woman of only moderate character. He had gone to sea as a boy in his father's ships and had been pressed into the Navy as a foremast hand. He had displayed great courage in battle, and had been a keen head for mathematics, which had won him a promotion first to master's mate, then to lieutenant, and even, by a stroke of luck, to post rank. But he had never lost any of the coarseness in his background. What was worse, Barstow had been conscious of his own lack of social graces, and resentful of those who, in his mind, made him feel that lack. It was not unmerited resentment. There were many officers who looked askance and murmured at him. But he had seen in Lawrence's easy and pleasing manners a deliberate insult, and he had been merciless in punishing Lawrence for them. Barstow's death of pneumonia 3 months into the voyage had possibly saved Lawrence's own life, and at least had freed him from an endless days of standing double and triple watches, a diet of ship's biscuit and water, and the perils of leading a gun crew composed of the worst and most unhandy men aboard. That sounds like a listing of things that Captain Barstow was putting him through, or at least promising was going to happen. Lawrence still had an instinctive horror when he thought of the experience. He was not in the least prepared to be ruled over by another such man, and in Bowden's ominous words about the Corps taking anyone a hatchling would accept, he read a hint that his trainer, or perhaps his fellow trainees, would be of such a stamp. And those of you who've read ahead or who know what's coming know what the surprise is that he's not quite guessing yet that they're alluding to. And while Lawrence was not a boy of 17 anymore, nor in so powerless a position, he now had Temeraire to consider, and their shared duty. His hands tightened on the reins involuntarily, and Temeraire looked around. "Are you well, Lawrence?" he asked. "You have been so quiet." "Forgive me, I have only been wool-gathering," Lawrence said, patting Temeraire's neck. "It is nothing. Are you tiring at all? Should you like to stop and rest a while?" "No, I'm not tired, but you are not telling the truth. I can hear you are unhappy," Temeraire said anxiously. Is it not good that we are going to begin training? Or are you missing your ship?" "I find I am transparent before you," Lawrence said ruefully. "I am not missing my ship at all, no. But I will admit I'm a little concerned about our training. Powys and Bowden were very odd about the whole thing, and I'm not sure what sort of reception we'll meet in Scotland, or how we shall like it." "If we do not care for it, surely we can just go away again," Temeraire said. "It is not so easy. We are not at liberty, you know," Lawrence said. "I am a king's officer, and you are a king's dragon. We cannot do as we please." "I have never met the king. I am not his property." "Like a sheep," Temeraire said. "If I belong to anyone, it is you, and you to me. I am not going to stay in Scotland if you are unhappy there." "Oh dear," Lawrence said. This was not the first time Temeraire had showed a distressing tendency to independent thought, and it seemed to be only increasing as he grew older and started to spend more of his time awake. Remember, he was sleeping a lot when he was in the first few weeks. Excuse me. Lawrence was not himself particularly interested in political philosophy, and he found it sadly puzzling to have to work out explanations for what to him seemed natural and obvious. It is not ownership exactly, but we owe him our loyalty. Besides, he added, we would have a hard time of keeping you fed, with the crown not paying for your board. Cows are very nice, but I do not mind eating fish, Temeraire said. Perhaps we could get a large ship, like the transport, and go back to sea. Lawrence laughed at the image. Shall I turn pirate king and go raiding in the West Indies, and fill a covert with gold from Spanish merchant ships for you? He stroked Temeraire's neck. That sounds exciting, Temeraire said, his imagination clearly caught. Can we not? No, we were born too late. There are no real pirates anymore, Lawrence said. The Spanish burned the last pirate band out of Tortuga last century. Now there are only a few independent ships, or dragon crews at most, and those always in danger of being brought down. And you would not truly like it, fighting only for greed. It is not the same as doing one's duty for king and country, knowing that you are protecting England. Does it need protecting? Temeraire asked, looking down. It all seems quiet, as far as I can see. Yes, because it is our business, and the navy's to keep it so, Lawrence said. If we did not do our work, the French could come across the Channel. They are there, not very far to the east, and Bonaparte has an army of 100,000 men waiting to come across the moment we let him. That is why we must do our duty. It is like the sailors on the Reliant, who cannot always be doing just as they like, or the ship will not sail. In response to this, Temeraire hummed and thought. Deep in the belly, Lawrence could feel the sound reverberating through his own body. I don't know if it's quite like that, but who knows? Temeraire's pace slowed a little. He glided for a while and then beat back up into the air in a spiral before leveling out again, very much like a fellow pacing back and forth. He looked around again. Lawrence, I have been thinking. If we must go to Loch Laggan, then there is no decision to be made at present, and because we do not know what may be wrong there, we cannot think of something to do now. So you should not worry until we have arrived and seen how matters stand. My dear, this is excellent advice, and I will try to follow it, Lawrence said, adding. But I'm not certain that I can. It is difficult not to think of. You could tell me again about the Armada and how Sir Francis Drake and Conflagratia destroyed the Spanish fleet, Temeraire suggested. Again, Lawrence said. Very well, although I will begin to doubt your memory at this rate. I remember it perfectly, Temeraire said with dignity, but I like to hear you tell it. What with Temeraire making him repeat his favorite sections and asking questions about the dragons and ships which Lawrence thought even a scholar could not have answered, the rest of the flight passed without giving him leisure to worry any further. Even evening was far advanced by the time they finally closed in upon his family's home in Wollerton Hall, and in the twilight all the many windows glowed. Now remember, I think he thought there was going to be nobody at home and he could just stop off and show Temeraire like where he grew up, as a little bit of a get to know you on his way over there. Temeraire circled over the house a few times out of curiosity, his pupils open very wide. Lawrence, peering down himself, made a count of lit windows and realized that the house could not be empty. He had assumed it would be, the London season being in full train, but it was now too late to seek another berth for Temeraire. Temeraire, there ought to be an empty paddock behind the barns, to the southeast there. Can you see it? Yes, there is a fence around it, Temeraire said, looking. Shall I land there? Yes, thank you. I'm afraid I must ask you to stay there, for the horses would certainly have fits if you came anywhere near the stables. When Temeraire had landed, Lawrence climbed down and stroked his warm nose. I will arrange for you to have something to eat as soon as I have spoken with my parents, if they are indeed home. But that may take some time, he said apologetically. You need not bring me food tonight. I ate well before we left, and I am sleepy. I will eat some of those deer over there in the morning, Temeraire said, settling himself down and curling his tail around his legs. You should stay inside. It is colder here than Madeira was, and I do not want you to fall sick. There's something very curious about a 6-week-old creature playing nursemaid, Lawrence said, amused. Yet even as he spoke, he could hardly believe Temeraire was so young. Me too. I'd completely forgotten. It's only been 6 weeks. Temeraire had seemed in most respects mature straight out of the shell, and ever since hatching he had been drinking up knowledge of the world with such enthusiasm that the gaps in his understanding were vanishing with astonishing speed. Lawrence no longer thought of him as a creature for whom he was responsible, but rather as an intimate friend, already the dearest in his life, and one to be depended upon without question. And can you think of that? Captain Lawrence sailing along, I'm going to be a captain, probably going to marry Edith Garland or whatever, his soon-to-be betrothed, and in 6 weeks, life totally turned upside down, and you have met the dearest friend of your life. You know that, and it's a Chinese imperial dragon. Holy moly. Like, that's why such a riveting story if you've got a appetite for fantasy, like I know many of us do here. Mature straight out of the shell, gaps in understanding, he was no longer thought of creature responsible, intimate friend, the best of his life. The dearest of his life, and one to be depended upon without question. The training lost a little of its dread for Lawrence as he looked up at the already drowsing Temeraire, and Barstow he put aside in his memory as a bugbear. Surely there could be nothing ahead which they could not face together. I think a bugbear as a literal term is something that you think is there, is going to be an issue, is someone or something you should be worried about, but really it's like a phantom. It's really a mirage, if you will. Not something you should have been worried about. An exception. But his family he would have to face alone. Coming to the house from the stable side, he could see that his first impression from the air had been correct. The drawing room was brightly lit, and many of the bedrooms had candlelight in them. It was certainly a house party, despite the time of year. He had sent a footman to let his father know that he was home, and he went up to his room by the back stairs to change. He would have liked a bath, but he thought he had to go down at once to be civil. Anything else might smack of avoidance. He settled for washing his face and hands in the basin. He had brought his evening rig, fortunately. He looked strange to himself in the mirror, wearing the new bottle green coat of the Corps, with the gold bars on the shoulders in place of epaulets. Epaulets are those like gold circle things with like little tassels that hang down. You always see like captains wearing those. Yeah, so this is the equivalent of like being a captain in the Air Force. Gold bars on the shoulders. It had been bought in Dover, having been partly made for another man, and adjusted hastily while Lawrence waited, but it fit well enough. More than a dozen people were assembled in the drawing room. Besides his parents, the idle conversation died down when he entered, then resumed in hushed voices and followed him through the room. His mother came to meet him. Her face was composed, but a little fixed in his expression, and he could feel her tension as he bent to kiss her cheek. "I am sorry to descend on you unannounced in this fashion," he said. "I did not expect to find anyone at home. I'm only here for the night, and bound for Scotland in the morning." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear it, my dear. But we are very happy to have you, even briefly," she said. "Have you met Miss Montague?" The company were mostly long-standing friends of his parents, whom he did not know very well, but as he had suspected might be the case, their neighbors were among the party. Edith Gallman was there with her parents. He was not sure whether to be pleased or unhappy. He felt he ought to be glad to see her, and for the opportunity which would otherwise not have come for so long. Yet there was a sense of whispering undercurrent in the glances thrown his way by the whole company, deeply discomforting, and he felt wholly unprepared to face her in so public a setting. Her expression as he bowed over her hand gave him no hint of her feelings. She was of a disposition not easily ruffled, and if she had been startled by the news of his coming, she had already recovered her poise. "I'm glad to see you, Will," she said in her quiet way, and though he could not discover any particular warmth in her voice, he thought at least she did not seem angry or upset. Unfortunately, he had no immediate opportunity to exchange a private word with her. She had already been engaged in conversation with Bertram Wolvey, and with her customary good manners. She turned back once they had completed their greetings. Wolvey made him a polite nod, but did not make any move to yield his place. Though her parents moved in the same circles, Wolvey had not been required to pursue any sort of occupation, besides being his father's heir, and lacking any interest in politics, He spent his time hunting in the country or playing for high stakes in town. He means like gambling, poker, and such. Lawrence found his conversation monotonous, and they never became friends. In any event, he could not avoid paying his respects to the rest of the company. It was difficult to meet open stares with equanimity, so people are just like gawking at him. And the only thing less welcome than the censure in many voices was the note of pity in others. By far the worst moment was coming to the table where his father was playing whist. It's a card game. Lord Allendale looked at Lawrence's coat with heavy disapproval and said nothing to his son at all. The uncomfortable silence which fell upon their corner of the room was very awkward. Lawrence was saved by his mother, who asked him to make up a fourth in another table, and he gracefully sat down and immersed himself in the intricacies of the game. His table companions were older gentlemen, Lord Galman and two others, friends and political allies of his father. They were dedicated players and did not trouble him with much conversation beyond what was polite. He could not help glancing towards Edith from time to time, though he could not catch the sound of her voice. Wolvie continued to monopolize her company, and Lawrence could not help but dislike seeing him lean so close and speak to her so intimately. Lord Galman had to gently call his attention back to the cards after his distraction delayed them. Lawrence apologized at the table in some embarrassment and bent his head over his hand again. "You're off to Loch Lagan, I suppose," Admiral Mackinnon said, giving him a few moments in which to recapture the thread of play. "I lived not far from there as a boy. A friend of mine lived near Lagan village. We used to see the flights overhead." "Yes, sir, we are to train there," Lawrence said, making his discard. Viscount Hale, to his left, continued to play, and Lord Galman took the trick. They're a queer lot over there. Half the village goes into service, but the locals go up. The aviators don't come down, except now and again to the pub to see one of the girls. Easier than at sea for that, at least." Having made his coarse remark, Mackinnon belatedly recalled his company. He glanced over his shoulder in some embarrassment to see if any of the ladies had overheard, and dropped the subject. Wolvie took Edith in to supper. Lawrence unbalanced the table by his presence and had to sit on the far side, where he could have all the pain of seeing their conversation with none of the pleasure of participating in it. Miss Montague, on his left, was pretty but sulky-looking, and she neglected him almost to the point of rudeness to speak to the gentleman on her other side, a heavy gamester whom Lawrence knew by name and reputation rather than personally. To be snubbed in such a manner was a new experience for him, and an unpleasant one. He knew he was no longer a marriageable man, but he had not expected this to have so great an impact upon his casual reception. And to find himself valued less than a wastrel with blown hair and mottled red cheeks was particularly shocking. Viscount Hale, on his right, was only interested in his food, so Lawrence found himself sitting in almost complete silence. Still, more unpleasantly, without conversation of his own to command his attention, Lawrence could not help overhearing while Wolvie spoke at length, with very little accuracy, on the state of the war with England and England's readiness for invasion. Wolvie was ridiculously enthusiastic, speaking of how the militia would teach Bonaparte a lesson if he dared to bring across his army. Lawrence was forced to fix his gaze upon the plate to conceal his expression. Napoleon, master of the continent, with 100,000 men at his disposal, to be turned back by militia. Pure foolishness. Of course, it was the sort of folly that the War Office encouraged, to preserve morale. But to see Edith listening to this speech approvingly was highly unpleasant. Lawrence thought she might have kept her face turned away deliberately. Certainly she made no effort to meet his eye. He kept his attention for the most part fixed upon his plate, eating mechanically and sunk into uncharacteristic silence. The meal seemed interminable. Thankfully, his father rose very shortly after the women had left them, and on returning to the drawing-room, Lawrence at once took the opportunity to make his apologies to his mother and escape, pleading the excuse of the journey ahead. But one of the servants, out of breath, caught him just outside the door of his room. His father wanted to see him in the library. Lawrence hesitated. He could send an excuse and postpone the interview, but there was no sense in delaying the inevitable. He went back downstairs slowly, nevertheless, and found his hand on the door just a moment too long. But then one of the maids came by, and he could not play the coward any more, so he pushed it open and went inside. Oof, pardon my little spit there. "I wonder at your coming here," Lord Allendale said at the moment the door was shut. Not even the barest pleasantry. "I wonder at it indeed. What do you mean by it?" Lawrence stiffened, but answered quietly. "I meant only to break my journey. I am on my way to my next posting. I had no notion of your being here, sir, or having guests, and I am very sorry to have burst in upon you." "I see. I suppose you imagined you would remain in London. I suppose you imagined we would remain in London, with this news making a 9 days' wonder and spectacle of us? Next posting, indeed." He surveyed Lawrence's new coat with disdain, and Lawrence felt at once as poorly dressed and shabby as when he had suffered such inspections as a boy brought in fresh from playing in the gardens. "I'm not even going to bother reproaching you. You know perfectly well what I would think of the whole matter, and did not weigh with you. Very well. You will oblige me, sir, by avoiding this house in the future, and our residence in London, if indeed you can be spared from your animal husbandry long enough to set foot in the city." Lawrence felt a great coldness descend on him. He was very tired suddenly. He had no heart at all to argue. He heard his own voice almost as if from a distance, and there was no emotion in it at all as he said, "Very good, sir. I shall leave at once." He would have to take Temeraire to the commons to sleep, undoubtedly scaring the village herd, and buy him a few sheep out of his own pocket in the morning, if possible, or ask him to fly hungry if not, but they would manage. "Do not be absurd," Lord Allendale said. "I'm not disowning you. Not that you do not deserve it. But I do not choose to enact a melodrama for the benefit of the world. We will stay the night and leave tomorrow, as you declared. That will do very well. I think nothing more needs to be said. You may go." Lawrence went back upstairs as quickly as he was able. Closing the door to his bedroom behind him felt like allowing a burden to slip off his shoulders. He had meant to call for a bath, but he did not think he could bear to speak to anyone, even a maid or a footman. To be alone and quiet was everything. He consoled himself with the reminder that they could leave early in the morning, and he would not have to endure another formal meal with the company, nor exchange another word with his father, who rarely rose before 11, even in the country. He looked at his bed a moment longer. Then abruptly he took an old frock coat and a worn pair of trousers from his wardrobe, exchanged these for his evening dress, and went outside. Temeraire was already asleep, curled neatly about himself, but before Lawrence could slip away again, one of his eyes half opened, and he lifted his wing in instinctive welcome. Lawrence had taken a blanket from the stables, and he was as warm and as comfortable as he could wish, stretched upon the dragon's broad foreleg. "Is all well?" Temeraire asked him softly, putting his other foreleg protectively around Lawrence, sheltering him more closely against his breast. His wings half rose, mantling. "Something has distressed you. Shall we not go at once?" The thought was tempting, but there was no sense in it. He and Temeraire would both be the better for a quiet night and breakfast in the morning, and in any case, he was not going to creep away as if ashamed. "No, no," Lawrence said, petting him until his wings settled again. "There is no need, I assure you. I've only had words with my father." He fell silent. He could not shake the memory of the interview, his father's cold dismissiveness, and his shoulders hunched. "Is he angry about our coming?" Temeraire asked. Temeraire's quick perception and the concern in his voice were like a tonic for his weary unhappiness, and it made Lawrence speak more freely than he meant to. "It was an old quarrel, at heart," he said. He would have had me go into the church, like my brother. He's never counted the navy an honorable occupation." "And is an aviator worse, then?" Temeraire said, a little too perceptive now. "Is that why you did not like to leave the navy?" "In his eyes, perhaps, the corps is worse, but not in mine. There is too great a compensation." He reached up to stroke Temeraire's nose. Temeraire nuzzled back affectionately. "But truly, He has never approved of my choice of career. I had to run away from home as a boy for him to let me go to sea. I cannot allow his will to govern me, for I see my duty differently than he does." Temeraire snorted, his warm breath coming out as small trails of smoke in the cool night air. "But he will not let you sleep inside?" "Oh, no," Lawrence said, and felt a little embarrassed to confess the weakness that had brought him out to seek comfort in Temeraire. "I only felt I would rather be with you than sleep alone." But Temeraire did not see anything unusual in it. "So long as you are quite warm," he said, resettling himself carefully and sweeping his wings forward a little to encircle them from the wind. "I'm very comfortable. I beg you to have no concern," Lawrence said, stretching out upon the broad, firm limb and drawing the blanket about himself. "Good night, my dear." And he was suddenly very tired, but with a natural, physical fatigue. The bone-deep, painful weariness was gone. Oh, we've got several pages to go, folks. I'm going to have to leave you here. Thanks so much for sticking with me. We're going to keep these things coming in snippets if we have to, but things are really heating up as we see Lawrence and Temeraire joining the Aerial Corps on their way. And also we'll see what the morning brings, because I know there's going to be some pretty cool encounters with Lawrence and some of the company in the house. See you on the next one. We continue on with Chapter 5. He woke very early, just before sunrise, as Temeraire's belly rumbled strongly enough for the sound to rouse both of them. "Oh, I am hungry," Temeraire said, waking up bright-eyed and looking eagerly over at the herd of deer milling nervously in the park, clustered against the far wall. Lawrence climbed down. "I will leave you to your breakfast and go to have my own," he said, and giving Temeraire's side one final pat before turning back to the house. He was in no fit state to be seen. Fortunately, with the hour so early, the guests were not yet about, and he was able to gain his bedroom without any encounter which might have rendered him still more disreputable. He washed briskly, put his flying dress on, while a manservant repacked his solitary piece of baggage, and went down as soon as he thought acceptable. So you already can tell, well-to-do, his father being a British politician, they have servants and things like that. The maids were still laying the first breakfast dishes out upon the sideboard, and the coffee pot had just been laid upon the table. He had hoped to avoid all the party, but to his surprise, Edith was at the breakfast table already, though she had never been an early riser. She's obviously there for him. Her face was outwardly calm, her clothing in perfect order, and her hair drawn up smoothly into a golden knot. But her hands betrayed her, clenching together in her lap. She had not taken any food, only a cup of tea, and even that sat untouched before her. "Good morning," she said, with a brightness that rang false. She glanced at the servants as she spoke. "May I pour for you?" "Thank you," he said, the only possible reply, and took the place next to her. She poured coffee for him, and added half a spoonful of sugar and cream each, exactly to his tastes. They sat stiffly together, neither eating nor speaking, until the servants finished the preparations and left the room. "I hoped I might have a chance to speak with you before you left," she said quietly at him at last, looking at him at last. "I'm so very sorry, Will. I suppose there was no other alternative?" He needed a moment to understand she meant his going into harness. Despite his anxieties on the subject of his training, he had already forgotten to view his new situation as an evil. "No, my duty was clear," he said shortly. He might have to tolerate criticism from his father on the subject, but he would not accept it from any other quarter. But in the event, Edith only nodded. "I know as soon as I heard that it would be something of the sort," she said. She bowed her head again, her hands, which had been twisting restlessly over each other, stilled. "My feelings have not altered with my circumstances," Lawrence said at last, when it was clear she would say nothing more. He felt he already had received his answer by her lack of warmth, but she would not say, later on, that he had not been true to his word. He would let her be the one to put an end to their understanding. "If yours have, you need merely say a word to silence me." Even as he made the offer, he could not help but feel resentment, and he could hear an unaccustomed coldness creeping into his voice. a strange tone for a proposal. She drew a quick, startled breath and said almost fiercely, "How can you speak so?" For a moment he hoped again, but she went on at once to say, "Have I ever been mercenary? Have I ever reproached you for following your chosen course when all its attendant dangers and discomforts? If you had gone into the church, you certainly would have had any number of good living settled upon you. But by now, we could have been comfortable together, in our own home, with children, and I should not have had to spend so many hours in fear for you away at sea." She spoke very fast, with more emotion than he was used to seeing in her, and spots of color standing high on her cheeks. There was a great deal of justice in her remarks. He could not fail to see it, and be embarrassed at his own resentment. He half reached out his hand to her, but she was already continuing. "I have not complained, have I? I have waited. I have been patient. But I have been waiting for something better than a solitary life, far from the society of my friends and family, with only a little share of your attention. My feelings are just as they always have been, but I'm not so reckless or sentimental as to rely on feeling alone to ensure happiness in the face of every possible obstacle." Here at last she stopped. "Forgive me," Lawrence said, heavy with mortification. Every word seemed a just reproach. When he had been pleased to think of himself ill-used. "I should not have spoken, Edith. I had better have asked your pardon for having placed you in so wretched a position." He rose from the table and bowed. Of course, he could not stay in her company now. "I must beg you to excuse me. Pray accept all my best wishes for your happiness." But she was rising also and shaking her head. "No, you must stay and finish your breakfast," she said. "You have a long journey ahead of you. I am not hungry in the least. No, I assure you, I am going." She gave him her hand and a smile that trembled very slightly. He thought she meant to make a polite farewell, but if that was her intention, it failed at the last moment. "Pray, do not think ill of me," she said, very low, and left the room as quickly as she might. She need not have worried. He could not. On the contrary, he felt only guilt for having felt coldly towards her, even for a moment, and for having failed in his obligation to her. Their understanding had been formed between a gentleman's daughter with a respectable dowry and a naval officer with few expectations but handsome prospects. He had reduced his standing through his own actions, and he could not deny that nearly all the world would have disagreed with his own assessment of his duty in the matter. And she was not unreasonable in asking more than an aviator could give. Lawrence had only to think of the degree of his attention and affection which Temeraire commanded to realize he could have very little left to offer a wife, even on those rare occasions when he would be at liberty. He had been selfish in making the offer, asking her to sacrifice her own happiness to his comfort. He had very little heart or appetite left for his breakfast, but he did not want to stop along the way. He filled his plate and forced himself to eat. He was not left in solitude long. Only a little while after Edith had gone, Miss Montague came downstairs. I wonder if that was timed at all. Dressed in a too elegant riding habit, something more suitable for a sedate canter through London than a country ride, which nevertheless showed her figure to great advantage. She was smiling as she came into the room, which expression turned instantly to a frown to see him the only one there. And she took a seat at the far end of the table. Wolvie shortly joined her, likewise dressed for riding. Lawrence nodded to them both with bare civility, and paid no attention to their idle conversation. Just as he was finishing, his mother came down, showing signs of hurried dressing and lines of fatigue around her eyes. She looked into his face anxiously, so she must have gotten word he was awake. He smiled at her, hoping to reassure, but he could see he was not very successful. His unhappiness, and the reserve with which he had armored himself against his father's disapproval, and the curiosity of the general company, was visible in his face, with all he could do. "I must be going shortly. Will you come and meet Temeraire?" he asked her, thinking they might have a few private minutes walking, at least. "Temeraire?" Lady Allendale said blankly. "William, do you mean you have your dragon here, do you? Good heavens! Where is he?" "Certainly he is. How else would I be traveling? I left him outside behind the stables. in the old yearling paddock, Lawrence said. He will have eaten by now. I told him to make free of the deer. Oh, said Miss Montague, overhearing. Curiosity evidently overcame her objections to the company of an aviator. I have never seen a dragon. Pray may we come? How famous! It was impossible to refuse, although he would have liked to. So when he had rung for his baggage, the four of them went out to the field together. Temeraire was sitting up on his haunches, watching the morning fog gradually burn away over the countryside. Against the cold gray sky he loomed very large, even from a considerable distance. What a scene, walking out this open field and seeing for the first time ever, probably on your property, over this beautiful countryside, a black dragon, Crazy. Lawrence stopped for a moment to pick up a bucket of rags from the stables, and then led his suddenly reluctant party on a certain he led them on with a certain relish at Wolvie and Miss Montague's dragging steps. His mother was not unalarmed herself, but she did not show it, save by holding Lawrence's arm a little more tightly and stopping several paces back as he went to Temeraire's side. Temeraire looked at the strangers with interest as he lowered his head to be washed. His chops were gory with the remains of the deer, and he opened his jaws to let Lawrence clean away the blood from the corners of his mouth. There were 3 or 4 sets of antlers upon the ground. I tried to bathe in that pond, but it is too shallow, and the mud came into my nose, he told Lawrence apologetically. Oh, he talks, Miss Montague exclaimed, clinging to Wolvie's arm. The two of them had backed away at the sight of the rows of gleaming white teeth. Temeraire's incisors were already larger than a man's fist, and with a serrated edge. Temeraire was taken aback at first, but then his pupils widened, and he said very gently, Yes, I talk. And to Lawrence, Would she perhaps like to come up on my back to see around? Lawrence could not suppress an unworthy flash of malice. I'm sure she would. Pray, come forward, Miss Montague. I can see you are not one of those poor-spirited creatures who are afraid of dragons. No, she said, palely drawing back. I have trespassed on Mr. Wolvie's time enough. We must be going for our ride. Wolvie stammered a few equally transparent excuses as well, and they escaped at once, together, stumbling in their haste to be away. Temeraire blinked after them in mild surprise. Oh, they were just afraid. I thought she was like Volley at first. Remember the first dragon that they had met is the courier dragon, and it was kind of a not very intelligent-seeming dragon, not bred for that type of thing, the way that we understand Temeraire was as a Chinese imperial. It was like Volley at first. I do not understand. It is not as though they were cows. In any way, I have just eaten. Lawrence concealed his private sentiment of victory and drew his mother forward. Do not be afraid at all. There is not the least cause, he said to her softly. Temeraire, this is my mother, Lady Allendale. Oh, a mother. That is special, is it not? Temeraire said, lowering his head to look at her more closely. I am honored to meet you. Lawrence guided her hand to Temeraire's snout, and once she made the first tentative touch to the warm hide, she soon began petting the dragon with more confidence. Why, the pleasure is mine, she said. And how soft! I would have never thought it. I would never have thought it. Let's be accurate, okay? I'll give it a proper. Temeraire made a pleased low rumble at the compliment and the petting, and Lawrence looked at the two of them with a great deal of happiness restored. He thought how little the rest of the world should matter to him when he was secure in the good opinion of those he valued most, and the knowledge that he was doing his duty. What a cool statement or phrase to just pause on for a second. And isn't that so true? How little the rest of the world should matter to you when you are secure in the good opinion of those you value most and in the knowledge that you are doing your duty. Whatever that is to you as a parent, kid, spouse, you name it, partner, employee. I think if you know those two things, I'm doing the right thing, and the people I love and respect most respect me back and love me back. Pretty awesome feeling when you get that. Happiness doors. Temeraire is a Chinese imperial, he told his mother, with unconcealed pride. One of the very rarest of all dragons. The only one in all of Europe. Truly? How splendid, my dear. I do recall having heard that Chinese dragons are quite out of the common way, she said, but she still looked at him anxiously, and there was a silent question in her eyes. Yes, he said, trying to answer it. I count myself very fortunate. I promise you. Perhaps we will take you flying some day, when we have more time, he added. It is quite extraordinary. There's nothing to compare to it. Oh, flying indeed, she said indignantly, yet she seemed satisfied on a deeper level. She knows her kid is happy. What parent doesn't want to know that? When you know perfectly well I cannot even keep myself on a horse. What should I do on a dragon's back? I'm sure I do not know. You would be strapped on quite securely, just as I am, Lawrence said. Temeraire is not a horse. He would not try to have you off. Temeraire said earnestly, Oh, yes, and if you did fall off, I dare say I could catch you, which was perhaps not the most reassuring remark, but his desire to please was very obvious, and Lady Allendale smiled up at him anyway. How very kind you are. I had no idea dragons were so well-mannered, she said. You will take prodigious care of William, will you not? He's always given me twice as much anxiety as any of my other children, and he's forever getting himself into scrapes. Lawrence was a little indignant to hear himself described so, and to have Temeraire say, I promise you, I will never let him come to harm. I see I've delayed too long. Shortly the two of you will have me wrapped up in cotton batting and fed on gruel, he said, bending to kiss her cheek. Mother, you may write me care of the corps at Loch Lagan Covert in Scotland. We will be training there. Temeraire, will you sit up? I will sling this bandbox again. Perhaps you could take out that book by Duncan, Temeraire asked, rearing up. The Naval Trident? We never finished reading about the Battle of the Glorious First, and you might read it to me as we go. Does he read to you? Lady Allendale asked Temeraire, amused. Yes. Oh, wait, yes. You see, I cannot hold them... Oh, wait, sorry. No, this is Temeraire. Yes, you see, I cannot hold them myself, for they are too small, and I cannot turn the pages very well, Temeraire said. You are misunderstanding. She's only shocked to learn that I am ever to be persuaded to open a book. She was forever trying to make me sit to them when I was a boy, Lawrence said, rummaging in one of his other boxes to find the volume. You would be quite astonished at how much of a blue stocking I've become, Mother. He's quite insatiable. I'm ready, Temeraire. She laughed and stepped back to the edge of the field as Temeraire put Lawrence up, and stood watching them, shading her eyes with one hand as they drove up into the air, a small figure vanishing with the very beat of the great wings, and then the gardens and the towers of the house rolled away behind the curve of a hill. And we arrive at last at the end of Chapter 4. Thanks for bearing with me. And I feel like I've tripped up a little bit on my delivery on a couple of these past recordings. I can take it if you feel like that it's happening more often or something like that. The way I look at it is when my parents read to me or my teachers read to me some of these classics and stuff like that, they didn't get a chance to edit. You heard them kind of stumble over it, and it was just kind of part of the experience of just naturally letting some normal human read you some content. And that's kind of what happens in a live performance. And that's what you're getting here. Live, unfiltered, for better or for worse. And sometimes what comes out of my mouth or what I think about, maybe it's pithy, inspiring, you like it. And sometimes you're like, all right, what the heck, Nick, keep going, right? So hopefully I strike a decent balance. Again, thanks for bearing with me. We're on to Chapter 5. Lawrence has made peace with at least his mother and is definitely committed to his life ahead. So now we're probably going to see what's going on with this sort of instructor or way of instructing that he's going to discover at Loch Lagan. And I think it's going to be a big surprise for those who haven't read the book yet. No spoilers if you have, all right? Please subscribe if you want to get the instant alert when we move on to Chapter 5, or check out any of my other books. We've read a few books here on this channel, some timeless classics. See you on the next one.